Fantastic, and thank you both speakers for some really excellent talks. Wow, so much depth, so much to talk about. Can I also introduce a colleague of mine from BGSS, Ian Harris, who is our head of AWS technology at BGSS. He is, as well as handling some of our very large government organisations, he also carries out a lot of well-architected reviews, similar to myself. Okay, welcome, Ian.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
I'll start with you, Ian, actually, because I've seen one of your other talks about logging, and that's why I asked if you could kindly join us this evening. Because analysing logs, the actual analysis of logs with your Splunk and your Elasticsearch, that can actually be really expensive when you get stuck in some sage nodding from the other panelists. Ian, have you tackled this in your organisation?
Yeah, so we've tackled this a few times in a few different ways. So yeah, you often find that your login management and analysis pipeline works beautifully at low volumes, and then becomes eye-wateringly expensive very quickly, and or non-functional depending on the amount of infrastructure you put under it. So yeah, we've tackled it a few times, and as with most things consumption-based, it's make sure you only move what you need to move in most cases, but it's not an easy one to arrive at. Some specifics that we have hit is very much around watch for the value that you're getting per dollar, per pound, per euro that you're actually spending on that underlying log analysis pipeline. So one specific that we had was a usage of Elasticsearch, and I do call that this out in the talk that Bernard's referring to. And I'm a fan of Elasticsearch. Fantastic tool. But in this case, it was ingesting a copious amount of data with a curation period of around 13 days. And the issue with that was that the data wasn't particularly being looked at. So it was a standing cost. It was infrastructure that was there, and it was holding the log indexes. And in the end, we made the decision to go native on that solution, and we dropped back to using CloudWatch Logs. And then AWS gave me a Christmas present at reInvent, which was CloudWatch Logs Insights, which I've been waiting for a while. It was one of those that I was really hoping would be a reInvent present, and we moved the solution back to that. So we were ingesting once, and we could use insights for ad hoc analysis, and we moved everything back to metric filters, etc. So yeah, there's lots of options, but it's make sure that you're logging what you need, and make sure that it's cost effective at that level.
Thanks, Ian. Blanca, you nodded very wisely there. was there some experience on your project?
Yes. So in our case, because we work with data, there's like a host of like different parties involved delivering data to us. We kind of have we apply a different technique. So one side is kind of that log analysis. The other one is kind of keeping what we call the data lineage. So it's knowing from which provider what data you have received, what data you haven't received, and that's what we use to kind of set up those alarms and those automated emails that fire off without us having to wake up at 2 a.m. To then dive into why is this data not here. Basically, we are not the ones who need to fix it. We just need to notify someone else, and it needs to be dealt with whenever they're available. So, but yeah, definitely when you have kind of nitty-gritty issues that you don't really kind of forecast. I think that's when, things such as Splunk, Elasticsearch become really useful, because that's at the times that you need to like dig into logs, dig into history, and kind of understand more of the things. So, yeah, lots of pains.
Brian.
Oh, thank you. So this is one where I think there are opportunities, but the opportunities also present risks. So with logs and logging, you're getting an awful lot of information, and depending on the level of detail you're going for, like if you're down to the info level, then that's a high degree of volume. So in cases like this, I like to at least talk about whether or not you can do dynamic configuration management. So implementing a flag or a feature flag to actually decrease or increase the level of logging. With something like CloudWatch Log Insights, whatever you're logging, as you scan it, that's part of the cost. So if you're logging something that you're never going to use, you're paying for the opportunity to ignore it. So if it's possible for you to do it, lower your logging levels. If you do need that logging level under specific conditions, then use something like app config and set a feature flag to elevate the level of logging when necessary, and then put it back down. You can even look at this in terms of an event. So when certain conditions, certain performance is present, turn on or have app config change the logging level. So way to save money, also a way to put the focus on it when necessary, and you can still get everything you need out of the logs.
And another operation excellence best practice there of automating. Automate everything if you can.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. I have a few questions that I jotted down while the speakers were speaking. But if anybody in the audience would like to ask any questions, please add them onto the chat channel and I'll try and fit them in. Meanwhile, here's something that's been very close to my heart, and that's the actually getting businesses or organisations, so sort of business stakeholders, to come up with some KPIs that are actually relevant to them. It's the biggest stumbling block on every single project. So when I saw Blanca, when I was listening to your presentation and I saw your KPIs that went super slow to amazing, I thought, yeah, that there's a tip right there. How did you go about getting the business to actually tell you what were KPIs that were actually meaningful to them?
Okay, so these were a lot of conversations, okay, with different stakeholders. There are many teams across the BBC who use data. And basically, up to the time that we began doing the improvements, there was actually a lot of pain for them. So it was the perfect time to ask them, hey, we need your help solving this. Can you please tell us what sort of workloads you are running? What sort of business questions are you trying to answer? And then we kind of went through an exercise of just putting them in a table and graded them. What is the priority for the business? Does this align with like BBC kind of goals as a whole? And that's what kind of helped us determine from all of those insights, what were the queries that were kind of really critical, and what were the ones that we were saying to people, can you please maybe run this not as frequently, because the answer that you're trying to get, you don't need it every half an hour. You need it maybe every day. So it was kind of a way to have a conversation, understand what they were trying, but also kind of make them feel that they could make a difference to it. And it's been a lot of work, especially with my business analyst, my product owner. Okay, I always go join them in meetings, because I learned so much from the conversations that we've had, and that's how we kind of pick those metrics. Those metrics are the actual queries that are driving the kind of the key business questions.
Excellent, thank you. You mentioned two things there. One that I've seen work really well, and that's work with the BA. I think business analysts early in cloud adoption projects are so undervalued, and yet they add exactly that sort of measure. Your KPIs emerge. But the other point that I haven't tried, you said actually have your users experience pain, and then they're more likely to come up with some good KPIs. So apart from pain, Brian, have you got any tips for helping the business come up with some relevant indicators?
So it ends up being a conversation typically, but it's much easier after the fact when something goes wrong. Going back to if they say it stinks, and at that point in time, they know why. So much easier at that point. Now the upfront part, asking them what they're going to do, asking them the frequency with which they're going to act upon that information is super helpful. Much like in Blanca's situation, if they're not going to use the information every half hour, if they can push it off to running overnight, well, that decreases our overall capacity as necessary to start with, so it's going to help us manage costs, and they'll have the information in the morning. So going back to the conversation, what do you need? Why? How frequently will you use it? How frequently will you act on it? These are big parts of making that determination. But generally, it's much easier after they've seen and used the system for them to identify what was really important to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Ian, tough one for you, coming last. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the argument about working with a good BA up front. It's life-changing. But one of the things I quite like to do is to sit with the key users of the service. So especially if it's a web-based service and you're talking about KPIs such as dropping out of a selling funnel or something like that, There's nothing to replace the experience of sitting with somebody that knows the service really, really well and go through that funnel, how you expect to use it, and look for what they might be worried about, or look for what they really concern themselves with as part of that user journey, and then map that onto the KPIs for the service. And you generally find that there are only a handful of those really key indicators that the product owner actually looks after on a day-to-day basis, and then map those to the metrics. As Brian put it very well in the OE pillar, the KPIs and the metrics are what matters.
Thank you. Cheers. So there's a bunch of us, Ian, myself, John. We actually carry out a lot of well-architected reviews, so we go into a lot of different organisations. So I look at a different cloud workload in a different organisation once or twice every single month. Best part of my job. I absolutely love it. However, when I get that scorecard at the end, and then I have to present back to the clients or potential clients, monitoring, what on earth? I've come to the conclusion that a lot of clients believe that they are monitoring because AWS comes with so much already enabled. They click on CloudWatch and they go and look, we've got graphs. We must be monitoring, and yet they're not fulfilling the requirements across all 5 pillars because they're not basing decisions on facts at the end of the day. Brian, this is potentially your fault. How about you help us all out by giving us 3 or 4 where to start pointers when we're with these clients?
Where to start? Well, boy, that's a really hard one. I had not predicted this one. So where to start? I suppose we've got to go back to what are they trying to achieve? Like, what are you trying to do? And then let's figure out what the indicators are and look at that specifically. I hate it when people ask me, is 85% CPU utilization okay? That's just the worst question because they need to understand their application. But if they can tell me what good looks like, or tell me why they're frustrated, that will definitely be an indicator of where they should be monitoring. Generally, though, let's go back to CloudWatch. Let's take a look at their metrics and at least identify if they can tell me when something went wrong. Let's look at that point in time and see what the conditions were and determine what's exceptional so we can establish metrics and alarms around that. And with respect to the application, let's look at the logs. When something went wrong, what did that look like in the logs? And can we talk to the developer about making it more apparent for us? Because the log should tell us when something goes wrong, and also tell us when something goes right. So that 3-way conversation that should always happen between operations, development, and the line of business owner, the product owner, that should happen all the time. And in fact, that's what our ops metrics meetings are. We meet weekly. We talk about the metrics. We talk about, does it indicate success or not, or did something go wrong that we never identified? So having that continuing conversation week over week helps refine this and helps determine what information truly matters, and then make those changes over time.
Thank you. Ian, I know you must have this conversation quite frequently with clients. Where do you help them towards monitoring?
Again, I'm going to paraphrase some Brian stuff there. It very much is the conversation about what's important. So I talk a lot about alert fatigue and metric fatigue, in that you a lot, as you say, you switch CloudWatch on and you get a bundle of metrics out of there. But I find the initial first root cause analysis is instructive in what was actually important. So production level testing is where I would always first point somebody. It's get a production level environment and get the NFRs from that environment, and that's what you care about.
Right, thank you. I feel I've kind of already asked you this question, Blanca, so I'll try a slightly different angle. Okay, I apologise up front if this one's a bit tricky, but the one thing, when I saw your story about what you built and how rapidly it grew, I just had one great big alert going off in my head. Am I monitoring my AWS service limits?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Tell us about it.
Well, with Redshift, given that you purchase X amount of servers unless there's a mechanism in Rustling that you can read data outside from S3, and it's called Redshift Spectrum. Okay, so that can actually make your costs skyrocket very quickly. That's something that we had to kind of learn to put a clamp on, because all of a sudden we realized that we're spending more money every month by queries that were reading historical data, and we had not anticipating that usage than actually the data that was being held in the data warehouse. Okay, so you have to kind of understand early on where your costs can go, and also understand what are your expectations on your servers running. So I come from a software engineering background, so in past teams we've done what we call metrics-driven development, and it's about when you're developing a feature as a developer and you release it, how do you know it's working? Does it need a metric to show that it's working to the business, not just you? Because if you need to log into the AWS console or you need to SSH into a server to check the logs or go into Splunk, that means that it's hidden away inside the software development team. And then that means someone's going to have to wake you up to ask you how a service is doing, if there's a failure in a microservice that depends on it and things like that. So you need to learn to expose all of that to actually make your own life easier. Okay. And I've been woken up enough times, okay, to understand that that's needed.
Could I ask a follow-on question there? When the users were querying, including the historical perspective, right, and going back to Spectrum, were they actually using that information to inform a decision, or was it just because they could, they set the time boundary extremely large?
We learned by actually talking to the users that sometimes they weren't aware of it. So our power users have actually had to learn and understand when they are pulling data or why a query is actually kind of reading a huge data set, and they could be filtering early on.
They could get their data faster and have a more actionable set of information. Yeah, that I saw in your talk, you talked about patterns of user behavior, and looking at that early on, I thought that was awesome.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, I was going to go ask actually about, you're just getting on to my next question really. That's why I was just slightly flustered. I was a horrible feeling you were going to answer it for a minute. But most organisations only seem to really worry about cost when they get that huge embarrassing bill. Usually after their project's in full flight, it's starting to be valued from the business, start being used properly, and suddenly there's that big unexpected bill. So I was thinking, surely good monitoring should pay for itself in these scenarios and ward off some of these situations and make sure they don't happen again. I was thinking, Ian, have you had any specific relevant monitoring to avoid costs or to understand costs?
Yeah, I've certainly had experiences where the monitor wasn't in place, and we would have really enjoyed it being there. But yeah, it's so the important thing there is that, well, I'll give you an example from a serverless service, for example. The conventional wisdom is when you move to serverless from a virtual compute-based solution, it'll probably be cheaper. But there are still plenty of opportunities for that to go wrong. So one where we did see an issue was a call to an API from within the Lambda function, which was in the wrong place in the code, and that call cost money. But it happened about 1 million times more than it should, and that did show up in the monitoring that we had in place for the thresholds on that service usage. So those monitors can pay for themselves very, very quickly. So if you can baseline against what your workload should cost, and you can alert against that source of cost very easily, rather than the subjective waiting for the bill at the end of the day when the code drops, and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely not one that you don't want to think about.
So you managed to merge a couple of my questions there. I think this is my bonus question, and it'll be the last question on my list. Okay, let's start with Brian. Is there anything you shouldn't monitor? That you really shouldn't monitor?
Okay, that's you're asking for an exclusion set, and that's really hard to do. I think I prefer to look at it in terms of focusing on the things you do need. But if you have info level logs that are just there by default, just exclude them. If it's part of if your instance has, if you're using Unix-based instances, just exclude the stuff that you're not going to use. Just leave it out. Don't pass it forward. If metrics Well, generally the metrics apply in some capacity, but they might not be the things that drive your decisions, but they're there by default. Don't monitor denied sessions on your firewall, because that's going to happen all the time. There's no reason to track that. What you're really interested in is things that are active and get through. That's, I think, a common mistake that people pursue if they're trying to profile who's reaching that out to them and failing. It's just a lot of records that aren't going to be actionable. I think that's the one that really, I think, is probably most relevant, because everything that you deny that has no action, has no impact, there's no reason to monitor for that.
Yes, that is a biggie, that one. Blanca, was there anything that you've been monitoring and you just thought, nah, we really wouldn't do that again?
I think it's been based on things failing overnight. And when you wake up and you look at a monitoring dashboard, if there's too much noise in there when your eyes are still like half closed, then you have too many metrics in there. So that's kind of my measure, that you just need to have whatever is useful for a developer, for the business. Okay, everyone has like different views of the systems. When there's too much, people stop looking at them because they don't get any value.
Yeah, absolutely. Classic broken windows syndrome. Yeah. Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, I think it ties back to the alert/metric fatigue. So in a modern service, when I'm setting up the monitoring profile, the likelihood of me, the monitor for CPU will be there. I'm much more interested in service latency and error counts and user experience rather than the specific CPU on a box. So if I'm not operationally caring about that metric, then I probably shouldn't be recording it. And CPU is one of those that's getting a little bit long in the tooth for something that I would care about looking at day to day.
Can we contrast for a moment there?
Huh?
You may be collecting the information, it may be relevant at some point, but let's just not alert on it or not include it in our visualizations.
Exactly.
Because by the way, I admire the fact that you focused right away on the business outcome there. That was awesome. And monitoring for that specifically. But if you're not going to act on it, don't include an alert on it. Don't have it on your dashboard. Unless you're going to do something with it, just leave it out. And you can find out later you need it, but find out later you need it and then add it. Don't make more noise. That's the biggest mistake people make.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the point. The data can be there and it can be useful in an RCA, but until that point, I don't need to look at it on a daily basis.
Wonderful. Panelists, thank you very much for joining us, and some really great answers there. I'll hand over to John now to wrap up.